Hey guys, Memphis here. Just a friendly Canadian reminder to keep force spying, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube.
In traditional sports, not only are team sizes in certain games bigger, but roster sizes are almost always much bigger than a game like Counter-Strike, because you don't just have your starters, you have the bench players. Sometimes you might have 2-3 times as many players, including all the reserves and other teams that you might have within your organization. So in traditional sports, with the way contracts work, it's rare that an entire starting roster remains together for many, many years anyway. Usually 1 or 2 players are coming in and out. But if you have more players in your starting team, or you're a game that has lots of substitutions available and you have lots of bench players, then having a concept of a core is almost pointless, because nobody has the same team all the time anyway. Even teams that win the championship change from year to year. In fact, famously in American sports, for example, that is when players who are lesser members of your squad will cash in on their premium. Is when you win a championship, they'll know that they can go and get overpaid playing for a lesser team in the league, rather than staying and taking what essentially then would amount to a pay cut, which is staying on the same money when they've just won a championship and they're not a great player, a star player, and therefore elsewhere in their career they're not going to have many opportunities to make a lot of money, and this is when they often cash in. So the reason why in Counter-Strike the terminology of core, as in like the core players in the team, is useful is because it allows us to look at the team from a context of more than just one 5-man lineup. And the reason why I make such a stress on being one 5-man lineup, because this wasn't always the case in esports and Counter-Strike history. A lot of people in 1.6 especially used to ignore the concept of a 5-man lineup, and they would talk about Fnatic. So people would be talking in 2009 about Fnatic and things they did way back in 2007, even though only 3 players remained in the lineup from then. And actually the radical change in terms of getting mad firepower in 2009 compared to a more balanced, in fact, having to rely heavily on players like Forest type team, was so radically different that to me, it never made much sense to talk about just Fnatic in that way. Like, well, they did this, of course, a few years ago. Like, instead, it makes more sense to either talk about the core players, because then you could add in the obvious context, which would then be presented by the contrast of like, well, even though this is the same core, they've brought in a different set of players through recruiting methods, and therefore we've got the core that remains the same with the accomplishments, but the identity of the team has changed. This is why it gets tricky, because for me, using overall core, it's a good way to refer to multiple lineups. It's better than just saying the team name, because it tells you that it's core players, and that by implication, there are some players in the current lineup that don't fit into that. In that sense, a very simple use of the term is just that you take however many players remain from the lineups you want to discuss. And that means that depending on the time period, you might start with a core of 4 players, and then you might go to a core of 3 players, and you might go to a core of 2 players, as by the way a team like NIP famously has in CSGO. So in that sense, the very basic definition of core, just players who remain from a past lineup that are in this current lineup, is only really useful either to make it clear that the team might have undergone changes, or just to cite accomplishments of those specific players playing together. So if you have, I would say it's usually 3 or more players who've played together in a bunch of different lineups, even if they made quite radical changes in terms of some of the players, generally there's going to be a benefit, a reasonable quality to talking about that core's accomplishments, because they did keep the majority of the team together, 60% of their team together. I always say that even changing one player, even though on paper you change 20% of the team, depending on who it is, obviously if it's someone like Simple who leaves, really it's more than 20% of your team, but even 20% of a change to an organization, a company, a team, a group can have a big effect. If you made your team 20% better, well, yeah, that'd be a massive change, right? You could go from being the last place team to the best place in the whole world. So I've always thought that was an important distinction rather anyway in terms of context. But the problem with the very simplistic use of the word core is it doesn't tell you much beyond that. It only lets you say these players were in a past lineup, or these players accomplished a lot of things together, but without any set context of what they then did, unless you then add that in. So the problem for me is, especially when the change is a messy one, like, yes, there are 2 or 3 players remaining from the last lineup, but they're not even necessarily the most key players. Because the other thing is, when you say core, some people are going to think of core, I mean, we're ignoring the Dota context here, some people are going to think core means like the most important players, like the ones at the center of the team, the one that the team was built around. Well, that might be the case if you keep certain players in the team, but some players in the team who might leave or might join they actually might be the most important players, and even though we're taking like 3 players who remained and saying they're the core, they only became the core the second the other more important player left, and then that was just the way that you were left able to define it by the previous definition of like, these are the 3 players remaining. Because if you lose a superstar player, if you lose an incredible in-game leader who imposed a lot of his system and identity and idiosyncrasies onto his team, then even losing one player might radically change the core and actually makes it kind of difficult to talk about a core, because it's going to change so much of the identity of the team and mean that even though there are players who overlap, maybe the overlap's actually meaningless beyond just talking about those specific players in their career, but as a team, maybe it doesn't make sense to anymore. Like, imagine a team where they're the second or third best in their country, and the best team in their country takes 2 or 3 of their absolute best players, their superstar players. So you might think of a team like the current Luminosity squad, which took in the Twins and took in Steel, so players that are much more accomplished in certain senses at their roles, better than some of the remaining players. To talk about the core of the Luminosity team as Yell and Nekis doesn't really mean a whole lot, except if you're only talking about the career of Yell and Nekis, because as a team, it completely changes their identity. If anything, they've lost some of the players that people might have said were the core before then. The past lineups don't mean a whole lot in terms of what they accomplished and what they did for any of the tendencies of the current team. So it becomes a bit tricky then if we start using core in that terminology, or at least it's not very meaningful. Because what I would like, if possible, and I know that whenever you make a video like this, you can complain about something that happens. You're not going to change the entire industry. But just as a way of thinking about how we talk about this topic and the significance of it, is I'd love it if the term core was more about trying to identify the latter definition I alluded to. Who are the real core players? Who are the ones setting forth the identity of this team? Because what's good about doing that is that not only are we going to actually have to very carefully think about how is this team made up and who contributes what to the team, but then over time, we will actually be able to refine and make more and more accurate our definitions of teams, our characterizations of teams, our explanation of what their core identity was, the principles on which they played, how they found their success, why they had failures. If we can actually look at the key players within the team that made that up, we're going to be able to say meaningful things. So, for example, if people want to talk about the Astralis core, well, here's the funny thing. They're going to talk about it often in the historical context of Astralis and TSM and Dignitas, with lineups that famously used to often underwhelm. So in the case of the Dignitas lineup, they would make semi-finals and tournaments and never make the finals. When you're talking about the TSM lineup, you're talking about a team that could win tournaments and beat anyone, but couldn't win the major. When you're talking about the first Astralis with Glaive, here's a team that got very good, actually didn't win that many titles, won a major in quite close fashion, and then had a load of close games. If you're talking about the current Astralis, they've seemingly gotten over this choking aspect, so now we look at the aspect of, well, who is the core of Astralis? Well, people will say the core of Astralis are the 3 players that have played through most of the eras, right? So you're going to say Device, Dupree, and Zipnix. Now, the problem with that is if you look at someone like Zipnix, individually and in the context of his role, he's a very clutch player. So was he choking? Does he somehow make up the choking element of the Astralis core? It's kind of tough, right? Because the funny thing is, if you go back to each of the lineups of Astralis when they let their in-game leader go, people would have said when Fetish left, right, he was clearly part of the choking because he was calling bad T-sides. This is one of the failures they would have when they were in big games, or they didn't know how to use young players. Then go to Carrigan. People might have said, you know what, he wasn't as bad as Fetish, but maybe he did still choke because his teams could win the other tournaments, even big tournaments, but they couldn't win the majors. So did that have something to do with him as an in-game leader? But it continued on even beyond that. And in fact, it even continued into one of their very successful lineups, the one where they had Kirby. You could argue after Katowice, where they never won another tournament together, you could say they choked away a lot of these close games. Sure, it wasn't as bad as before. It wasn't as outrageous. They weren't getting blown out. But there were a lot of close games that those guys gave up and lost. And lots of semis they were in and finals that looked winnable and they just couldn't get it done overall. So then you go and you look at, so you think, right, well, that core, yeah, it probably makes sense, especially the Device and Dupree part. Maybe that fits. Device particularly, obviously, was a very notable member in that sense. But you look at other teams and the same problems occur. If you want to talk about the MIBR guys, so you want to talk about them mainly when they were SK Gaming, right? Obviously, as I mentioned in a video about them, you're going to talk about them being clutch and being amazing at comebacks and having a lot of poise and composure and grit and determination. And the problem with all those qualities are, it's going to get very tricky very early on. Because think about it. If you'd have talked about this team when they made the roster move at the end of 2016 and removed FNX, you just said, right, Well, clearly, FNX was a very key clutch player individually, and so part of them being clutch and having a lot of poise must be about FNX, right? I mean, he was one of the main members doing that in the original lineup. The problem is, the 2017 lineup actually won more tournaments, obviously less majors, but won more tournaments overall without FNX. And actually, that seemed to be where they really hammered home the whole thing of like epic comebacks, like never out of a game, can win from any odds. The 2016 lineup actually lost most of the times they were in those super close games throughout the year, including before when they were Luminosity, before they won the major, and after they won the major as SK and they had all those semis and finals. They actually lost most of those games. If anything, they didn't fully live up to the kind of mantle of like the clutch team or the team that are the hardest to beat. That's why I used to at the time still cite Na'Vi as the hardest team to beat, or Virtus Pro or something like that, you know, because actually you look at the SK team, this is why, funnily enough, one of the videos that seemed like one of the ones that ended up being the most wrong by me, where I said that they'd peaked as a team, a lot of the things I said in that video basically applied. They just had 4 tournaments that they won in the meantime. That didn't happen. In the majority of other tournaments over the year actually did happen. They were stuck at that kind of a level, believe it or not, before and after their era and their dominance. It's just that they won 2 majors, which is so epic that it gives them kind of, yes, a very differently defined major era rather, but an era nonetheless. So part of my problem with this is, then you might say, right, well, the only players that have been in all these top lineups for the team are Fur, Fallen, and coldzera, right? That's the core. That's who we're going to say the core is. Well, the problem with that is they had those 3 players playing before they got Taco. And you know what? That lineup wasn't particularly clutch. They weren't amazing at epic comebacks. They weren't even winning best of 3 series. They won like 1 ever against a ranked team. They were doing really fuck all, actually. They just won some best of 1s. They were pretty solid at the time for what we thought of as like a wild card, like outsider team. We were impressed with what they were doing, but they weren't a top team at all. They had none of these qualities that make up the identity of a team. So as I referenced in my video about their team, and how we can now appreciate what we lost with SK Gaming, to me, I think you have to look, if you want to look at the core in like a qualitative and characteristic defined aspect, you've got to include Taco as far as I'm concerned. Like, in fact, you could even make a case, you could say it's like Fallen, coldzera, Taco. Like, was Fur really that clutch? Was he really that good at come? I don't know. But Taco seemingly has to be in there, right? Because he had such an impact on coldzera's play. As soon as he left the team, they lost a lot of the identity of being clutch and having these comebacks, etc. Now, admittedly, he hasn't taken that over to Team Liquid as much. He's played well in certain scenarios, but it's not like they suddenly have been imbued with being a clutch team and come through. In fact, famously, they haven't. They've lost many, many finals and haven't won the big trophies that perhaps they could or should have done over the year. Finally, one last big key example would be the NIP core. Now, obviously, this was one of the easiest to look at as a core because it started as 5 players that played together for like 2 years. Then it went down to 4 players that played together for like, I think, 5 years. And then it went down to like 3 players that had played together for something like, I'm going to guess like 5.5 years or something. And now we're down to 2 players and they've played together, actually going beyond CSGO, right back in SK Gaming, right back in the Fnatic, and right back to the beginning of 2009. So, you know, like 9 years for those guys. So the problem with this is, obviously, the more players you take off is making that core more and more different, right? So what are the things that we think of when we think of the NIP core? Loose playing style, playing around their star players, weird vetoes, doing well at majors, being older players. Well, problem with that is every single one of those, as you've taken players off, is just eroded and eroded and eroded. Like now, there's only 2 players left. It's Get Right and Forest. So you still play around Get Right and Forest, sort of. Do you still play super loose? I mean, they've gone here and there. Like 2016, they won a bunch of championships not playing entirely loose because they had threat. Then you go and you look at, and they had a team that was a bit more balanced with like Pitt, for example. Then you go and look at aspects of like weird vetoes. Well, that actually kind of stopped when threat was there. And actually, ever since Exist left, doesn't seem to really be as big an issue. In fact, their vetoes seem pretty decent nowadays. Doing well at majors. Obviously, that just died of its own accord once they got to the period where they blew the E-League Major Atlanta, beginning of 2017. Technically, the qualifier was in December 2016. Being older players doesn't even apply now. They've got someone like Rez in the team. They've got someone like Lekro in the team. Dennis is less experienced than Get Right for Us, but is an older player, but at the same time hasn't played all the years of CSGO. See what I mean? Like, all the meaningful context that would have come with the term of core, for someone like NIP, just means nothing. It doesn't apply very much at all, except in that context that they just are the teams that carried over. So there are basically 2 usages of this term And each of them has a different function. You can either use it as a simple through line. These are the players that remain from this line to this line to this line. Therefore, in the most basic context, they're the core. Or you can try and do what I've done in this video with my examples, and I think it's a better use of the term generally, which is doing it in a meaningful manner. Like, the reason why I'm picking these players as the core is to tell a story about what ingredients they brought to a team, what elements of the identity of the overall team come from some of the set players within the team, and you can see this from lineup to lineup to lineup as they change players around themselves, like the Astralis example I gave before. Notice that was one of the easiest to use for the core example, whereas the other ones, like the SK one was a bit more hit and miss, but you could probably figure one out. The NIP one got very difficult entirely, actually, and it kind of disintegrated within our hands or evaporated away as I was explaining it, because as you changed the players, you saw so many of those qualities just didn't fit anymore. So the key thing for me, and what I like about the latter context or definition, is it actually requires that you either change it over history, and therefore you get to like double check or error check your concepts and characterizations of the team, or they make you reconsider entirely the concept of a core and how you're going to define it. So this is just a small video. It's more about terminology and semantics, but in a field in which we're trying to think about the game, and therefore we're going to need models, and then we're trying to explain to each other how we're thinking about the game and modeling the game. So we're going to need terminology that is shorthand, so every time we don't have to do a 10-minute explanation of what a term means. This stuff's actually valuable, and even if there's only 20 people out there who write articles or do podcasts and are nerds in that sense, it's something for them to think about when they try to tease apart the elements that make up the identity of a team, or their tendencies in terms of how they play or what they accomplish on their journey together through esports. This video was kindly supported by Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Landon Thompson, Tobias Bernasconi, OllieJ, NateDOhDoubleG, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, Daniel Yordanov, James Harding, VeXii, Robert Baxter, Lucas Kerza, Szczesny, and a special thanks, as always, goes out to my man, Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest to feature in my upcoming content? Perhaps you want to ask me a question in my monthly AMA. Do you want teasers from my upcoming content? See who the next guests are going to be. Perhaps you'd like to take part in a discussion about esports with me. Well, any and all of the above exclusives are available for my patrons, so put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.